Hi, I'm Moshe, and I'm autistic.
I'm Leah, and I'm boring.
Welcome to Now You Know One Autistic,
A podcast about neurodiversity in couples, marriage, meltdowns, and making it all work.
The opinions expressed in this podcast reflect the experience of one couple and one autistic.
Nothing that you hear in this podcast should be taken as a medical opinion. And unless otherwise stated, no one is an accredited specialist in any of the many fields that comprise the autism spectrum.
But, as someone who is on the autism spectrum, I feel that my experiences will be very valuable to many of you. Whether you're on the spectrum, a support person like Leah, or just a curious bystander.
If you think that you or someone you care about may be autistic, consult your family doctor. Hi, Moshe.
Hi, Leah.
How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm right. So we're going to be doing an episode about something that we actually went through recently.
Yes.
And how we feel about it. So what we're talking about is genetic testing for autism spectrum disorder and related disorders. And genetic testing pre-pregnancy and pre-IVF in general, I suppose, will be one of those things as well. Before we get into the meat of our experience, which was interesting, it wasn't bad, but it was up and down. We're going to talk about genetic testing in general and genetic testing for ASD, just so people have an idea of what it is before we get into, when we had to sit down with a genetic counselor and how that was traumatizing.
Right. Genetic testing is something that, unless you know that you have a specific condition or you know that your family has a specific condition, it really only comes up when you are trying to have a baby. Because when you are with a partner and you decide to do the thing where you sort of combine your DNA.
That's generally how babies happen.
Yes.
Did you know?
I did know. I had a sneaking suspicion. I just really like your smile. So the rest is just kind of a bonus. But the genetic testing thing often comes up in the case of trying to have a baby, because the question that a lot of the people ask is, do you know if you have a family history of this or if you have a family history of that? Leah and I are both Ashkenazi Jews on our mother's side. So with our particular line, there's definitely a higher instance of certain genetic conditions, but it's really only in the case of people who have like two parents who are Ashkenazi Jews, which we don't.
So when you're trying to have a baby, what they'll generally do is they'll test mom for all kinds of stuff, right? So they tested me for the Ashkenazi Jew diseases. One very prominent one, or used to be prominent, is Tay-Sachs.
Tay-Sachs,
which they always check Ashkenazi Jews for before they have babies, or they try to. They tested me for, genetic mutations that cause breast cancer and cervical, or was it ovarian cancer?
Ovarian cancer.
I don't have those. They suspect you have it on your side, but they haven't checked you because, of the lack of ovaries.
It would really only be girls that
you can carry the gene.
You can, but if you have a daughter, it could be affected by it, or if you have a son who in turn has a daughter, so if you have a granddaughter, they could carry the gene, because of course the boy would pass it along to another boy who would pass it along to a girl. And they could be wondering, why am I at a higher instance of not just ovarian cancer, but anything? And then they can trace the line back and see.
The reason we're saying that is because Moshe's mother, who we love very much, passed away from ovarian cancer. So it might be on his side, but his sister doesn't have it. So anyway, they didn't find it worth testing him for. So what they'll generally do is test mom, which they did, a battery of tests on me. Those were the two that I can think of right now, but they did also the general ones, trisomy, which is for Down syndrome, and spina bifida, but muscular dystrophy. Sorry, spina bifida is not genetic; it's a malformation.
Folic acid.
So they did, all that stuff. They looked for proteins in my blood cells and all that other stuff. They didn't find it necessary to test Moshe for anything, though they were very interested in his autism and ADHD diagnoses. And the third thing that can happen is when you either have an embryo or a baby, they can test the embryo or baby as well. we don't have either of those at the moment. I mean, we have older babies, and Raya has had genetic testing for other things, but yeah. And so that is how that generally will go. So I've had a battery of genetic tests at this point. Can genetic testing, it's done through blood, by the way, just for those who really have no idea. They draw a whole bunch of blood and they look at your DNA or specific parts of your DNA that they know cause certain disorders.
There are genetic testing that they do through saliva or through a cheek swab. You might have seen the commercials for like 23andMe and Ancestry.com.
I did Ancestry.
And that does some testing of genetics, but the really conclusive, like targeted genetic testing does have to be through blood tests, because you can tell, for example, by testing somebody's genetics through like a cheek swab, their matrilineal line, their patrilineal line, if they're at high instance for having wet earwax, or like unnecessary but interesting.
How much Neanderthal
you are. That was going to say that one. Like if you're related to Genghis Khan or something. But if you want to know, like if your child or if you yourself carry genes, blood tests are really the way to go, just to be sure.
I did the Ancestry. It showed literally 50 to 51% Ashkenazi and a bunch of other stuff. So, French and Italian and other things. I was curious about the other parts that I didn't know. So that was just for fun, though. That doesn't really diagnose anything.
Yeah, I mean, if you're into genealogy or whatever, it's kind of nice to see where you come from, or if you're adopted and you don't really know your birth parents, you might want to track them down. Or if you are, if you're looking for relatives, you can pay some money and stick a swab inside your cheek and send it to a bunch of people in a lab, and they can find your fifth cousin once removed who lives in some country and introduces you to a great grand relative that you never knew existed.
Okay. So we're kind of rambling. I just want to verify. So Moshe and I have both done the 23andMe and the Ancestry for fun. That doesn't diagnose anything.
Yes. So the actual instance, is sort of getting back on topic, we engaged in genetic testing because we're looking to increase our family. And of course, Leah and I want to get the testing done to, let's backpedal a bit. We didn't actually want to get the testing done. We were asked to get it done by the people that we were. In
Israel, it's kind of required because we're of a certain age.
Yeah, Leah's a little bit on the older side, still gorgeous, like a fine wine.
Thank you.
And I am like a different kind of wine. Anyway, the wine analogy doesn't work. But the point is, because of our age, which isn't that big a deal in Israel, because people continue to have children until they're physically not able to.
But they like to do tests.
They want to know, just so you know, what the chances are, and of course, they test for a variety of genetic conditions, or what they suspect are conditions that have genetic links, which brings us to the topic of the episode today.
Right. So that is the medical testing that we've done, mostly me. So I had 9 or 10 vials of blood taken. And that is more of a diagnostic thing in terms of that. So if mom has issues, then they'll check dad. If dad and mom have issues, then they'll check baby or fetus or embryo or zygote.
And we had some conversations, which we'll get into.
Oh, we'll get into it. So my first question to you, Moshe, is can genetic testing diagnose ASD?
The answer to that question is possibly.
So the answer to that question from my research is probably not.
Yes.
At best, sometimes.
They can detect some genetic links that might lead to a higher instance of people developing ASD,
right.
But they can't definitively state this gene here causes autism.
Right. So they will never actually diagnose autism based on a genetic or blood test, ever. Not without it being in conjunction with the formal testing, which you and Avram have both had, right? So the 802 that you filled out and the other diagnostic tests that you filled out and the tests for ADHD and stuff,
right.
Which are written tests, which you're supposed to do partially on your own, partially with your partner or parent if you have one, because sometimes we're not the best at knowing how we actually act or feel about things.
Autism is weird, though, because unlike some other genetic conditions, Because if a child is in utero, or a child is newly born, or a child is, developing, you can look at them sometimes and go, well, that baby has, trisomy, that baby has this, that baby has that, that baby has something. There's definitely something going on with that baby. But autism is one of those conditions that they label as invisible, in that you could look at a baby and you can't definitively look at the baby and go, oh, you see right there, that autism right there.
So that's why essentially you need the written tests combined with somebody actually observing you. So somebody who's trained in this, right? So either a neurologist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist. Or in the case of Avram, a developmental pediatrician, which is an extremely specialized specialty. And they will diagnose you with autism spectrum disorder and often ADHD as well. And then they can investigate genetic reasons. But our question ultimately is why? Because once you've been diagnosed with autism, they're sort of very early on in terms of defining which genes actually might cause autism. And even if you find them, it's not going to improve your quality of life, your treatment, or find a cure. Right. So ultimately, we feel like the genetic investigation of autism is essentially for the curiosity of the scientists who are doing it.
And there's a few things that we saw or read about in terms of some of the testing that was done and the reasons behind it.
There are some useful ones. So if they can diagnose a syndrome that has ASD as one of the symptoms, then it can absolutely help the treatment of that person, because those often come with other health problems. Right? So like heart problems or, walking problems or whatever. So there are a few syndromes that tend to have ASD as a symptom or a much higher level of ASD within them. And those can be determined genetically. But just for your garden variety ASD, I don't know. We're not so sure how we feel about that.
Yes, because ASD is interesting in that it's a condition, or if you use the actual term, it's a disorder. But it's also a symptom of other disorders. Or like Leah says, it's a there's certain other syndromes, genetically caused syndromes, that allow a person to have a very high or almost, inevitable diagnosis of autism. And if you can identify autism from a genetic component, and you know that this child has this syndrome, which also comes with physical things or predispositions for kidney issues or heart issues or digestive issues, then you can go, okay.
Then you can test the heart and the kidneys. And
that kid is autistic, but also they have this, which means we have to check these things.
Which is the only reason we honestly found, after really looking into it, that we thought was even somewhat necessary for genetic testing for ASD. Another reason why we find it so unnecessary is because there are currently 1,000 single genes and 17 genetic regions. So when you talk about genetic regions, I believe they're talking about, help me here, not genes, but chromosomes. They're talking about chromosomes that have been associated with ASD. Therefore, if you can find 1,000 of something that may or may not cause something, is it actually really that useful to you to do it?
It's really one of those instances, going back to the analogy of Ancestry.com, where you run your genetics through their filter, and you go, well, this particular person has, a certain percentile of shared chromosomes or genes or whatever with you, so it's quite likely that they're a cousin of yours. And your answer to that would be, oh, interesting. And then that's really
But it's really inaccurate, because I have an aunt who I know is my aunt.
Right.
And genetically, they said she is a close relative of yours. She might be your aunt, your sister, or your mother.
Right.
So it's not like a targeted thing the way people think, or the way they show it in the movies.
It's kind of like a shotgun versus a laser.
Yeah.
You kind of have a whole range of potentials versus this is 100% unreservedly the case.
So as of 2022, only 3 to 40% of people will get a genetic diagnosis. So they've already done the ADOS2. They've already done, being seen by a neurologist. They've already gotten that diagnosis on paper. And then they'll look at their genes, and only 3 to 40% of those people will they find a genetic diagnosis.
Right.
Now, does that mean they don't have a genetic predisposition? No. What it means is that currently genetics is very limited. They don't actually know what they're looking for. So if you don't look at the part of the genes or the chromosomes that are causing the issues, then you're not going to see it. So it's going to come up as a non-test or a negative test. It doesn't mean it's not there. It just means they can't find it or they don't know what they're looking for.
Right. And that's why we actually saw a video that said that if you don't get a diagnosis of a genetic autism, then you actually can come back in a few years and test again, because they're still so early in the stages of identifying genetic links to autism that constantly new research is being reached. And today they might say you don't have a genetic link to autism, but then in 10 years they might go, oh, see, that gene is what we now know causes autism, but it's not there. So it's for lack of a better term, a crapshoot. Because you never know if the negative you're getting is a definitive no, or if it's a not right now type of thing.
Exactly. And either way, it's not a no, because if a psychiatrist has diagnosed you with ASD, you have ASD. If you meet the criteria, you have it, regardless of whether your genes say you do or not.
And that is essentially what they told me, because I have a formal diagnosis of autism, of ASD and ADHD. And then when we start talking about genetic testing, it was like, okay, so you have your diagnosis, that's wonderful. You should probably also investigate your genetic links that might have caused your autism. And we had a discussion about it. And then again, it really came back to the question of why. What's the point?
And the answer, so geneticists don't like to say this, okay? They will sit with you and they will say, well, it's for your health. It's to make sure for your general health. It's to see for the health of your offspring. It's to see, family stuff. And then eventually they'll start using terms like family planning. And then eventually, if you push them enough, they will tell you, so that you could exclude embryos, or so that you could decide whether you really want to mix those genetics together to see, if the baby's going to be functional, healthy. They like to use the word healthy. If the baby's going to be healthy.
If you're fortunate enough to be fertile, then you can essentially do the things that, men and women do to get pregnant. And then the baby comes out and it's there. Like there's not a whole lot you can do about it. But if you're going through more designer methods, like IVF or other things, then you're essentially taking a natural process and making it into a moral debate. Because what they're really asking you is, if you're going through IVF and you are creating, a certain number of viable embryos, and they're just kind of sitting there, do you want us to have the ability to look at them and go, well, that one doesn't have a genetic predisposition for autism, that one does, so we're going to take the one that doesn't, because you don't want to give that opportunity to your child.
So essentially what they're talking
about, and that's eugenics.
Ultimately is eugenics.
That's all it is.
And that's the only reason, other than the, syndromatic with other health problems, that we could see that people would want to do genetic testing for ASD or ADHD or any non-life-threatening difference that they would want to weed out of their family. And there are people who absolutely would want to do that. And I have opinions, but I'm not going to pass moral judgment.
And I have opinions too, and I can speak from firsthand experience.
But we're Jews. We know what eugenics is.
Yes.
When we see it.
Unfortunately, eugenics is something that the Jewish people throughout history have a very long and bad history with, because it's something that happened. And, anyway, we're not going to get into it because this is a podcast about neurodivergency, not, genetics. But essentially, look up, Dr. Mengele and the people who conducted.
Look up Dr. Asperger.
Yes. Dr. Asperger. People who essentially, their job was to either try to find what makes a person fit and what makes a person unfit, and then what to do with the ones who are unfit. And that is, unfortunately, something that's still happening today. Because if you, and again, this is a podcast about autism and neurodivergency, it's not a podcast about religion. But if you are the kind of person who believes, I don't want to get into pro-choice or pro-life, but if you're the kind of person that believes that a child is a child, then you have to decide if you're comfortable with, that kind of tinkering with essentially what amounts to God.
Mhm.
And that is not something that everyone is going to want to do, and not something that, honestly, I feel should be available if there's a chance. Because, and again, this is a slippery slope, and I'm trying very hard not to get into it. But if you are looking for a predisposition genetically for something that will cause the child immeasurable pain, reduce his lifespan, cause them constant health issues,
Like Tay-Sachs, that's why we test for that.
then you're going to go, you know what? I get it, but also I would rather have a child that I can, who's going to live a healthy, hopefully long life, versus a child, that I'm going to take a chance that I'm going to have a child that may end up having a life of pain and suffering and drastically reduced. But autism is not like that. I'm autistic. Avram is autistic. There are many autistics out there, except for being somewhat, I don't know. They have some processing issues, but it's not fatal. It's not causing them pain. It's not causing them to be, challenged in some way. And when you have a child, any child, you don't know if that child's going to sleep through the night. It's going to have digestive issues. It's going to be lactose intolerant. It's going to have colic. It's going to have frequent ear infections. It's going to have asthma. It's going to have any number of conditions.
Right.
So you're just basically, if you want to go along the idea of creating a superman or superwoman kind of child, then what's the point anymore?
I mean, I have a very strong genetic predisposition to asthma. My mother's asthmatic. I'm asthmatic.
Right.
Our daughter's asthmatic. Moshe could look at me and say, do I really want those asthma genes in my baby? And that's kind of where we feel that we're at in terms of the autism gene as well. Yes, it definitely causes people to have a harder life. Yes, it definitely causes, I'm not minimizing the struggles of people with autism. Please don't take it that way. But is it worthy of saying this person doesn't deserve to exist? I mean, I would ask an autistic, ask any autistic, do you like your life? Are you happy that you're alive? And some would say no, but a lot would say yes.
Unfortunately, people with autism are at a higher instance of mental illness and suicide. But I think that has far more to do with a lack of support versus a constant struggle. There was an article in the paper in Canada not too long ago about a woman who was trying to do the medical assistance in dying program because she was autistic. And it really kind of horrified us because, to my understanding, again, I'm autistic. My son is autistic. And sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes, it's challenging. But is autism something that you would be willing to look at a child and go, you don't deserve to live because you might be autistic? I would argue no. And for me, I believe that I am in a position to make that call because, again, I am autistic and I would very much like to have been allowed to continue to live if my mother had been given the choice.
Right.
So I am not a mistake. I am not an accident. I am not an error. I am a human being. And while I do have my own challenges and my own difficulties, I have a lot to contribute. And I believe that my life is valuable. And the life of any child who has the chance of developing autism is just as valuable. We are not trying to create a super race. We're just trying to have a family.
Right.
And that's really what this is about.
With all the diversity and challenges that come with that, because every human being is born diverse. That's what sexual reproduction does.
Right. So,
versus, cloning or whatever. And everyone has their own challenges in life.
Everyone does. If your skin is a little bit lighter, you can't be in the sun as much. If your eyes are blue, if you have a predisposition
that's
for...
the thing. I like Moshe's blue eyes, but I'm not going to choose our child eye color.
Diabetes, or like there's a lot of variables that a child could develop, and you could go through all the testing and try and theoretically weed out every little thing that they have the ability to test, and then boom, there's like something else that they didn't expect that comes up anyway.
But how many things do they not have the ability to test? If you talk to, again, an honest geneticist, they will tell you. There are so many things they don't have the ability to test because they haven't studied it yet, because they haven't found it yet, because they don't know.
Exactly.
The human genome is huge.
It really is.
Speaking of which, speaking of mistakes and spelling errors in the genome, let's get back to genetics. So there are two types of changes that you could see in somebody's genes. So basically against the expected, right? One is called monogenic and the other is called polygenic. Now mono means one, poly means many, just for those of you who are out there. So monogenic changes means that there's one change in the genes, right? So one gene is off, it's knocked over, it's misspelled, it's the wrong letter, and then it'll maybe knock over another gene further down the line and cause some sort of a diagnosis. So, a syndrome or an issue like asthma, like I have, or an issue like cancer, for example. And then there are polygenic changes, which are multiple but subtle changes in many, many genes that will cause a very complex disorder like autism. And they just don't really have the technology, truthfully, to look in detail at all of those little changes. So it may be the way genes work, right? They're lettered. And you expect, an A to be here, a G to be there, a T to be there. And it may look like you're AGT, and then suddenly there's another T there somewhere. And you have many of those in a line, and it could cause nothing, or it could cause autism, or it could cause, I don't know, skin rashes. I don't know. It could cause anything.
Right. There's certain genetics that are very clear. They don't really
have the ability to do that reliably.
Right.
Or they do, but it costs a lot of money, and then you're looking at every single gene. And even then, if they don't know what that gene does, turned on or turned off, you're going to have to go back in a few years anyway once they've done more research.
Exactly. Certain things are very easy to detect. Certain things are not. Certain things are detected very simply through pure genetics.
Right.
The reason that
Down syndrome is a chromosome.
It is.
Chromosomes are the big parts, right?
So you get a certain number of chromosomes from your mother and a certain number from your father.
I think they have an extra.
Now, what Down syndrome is, Down syndrome's actual scientific name is trisomy 21, because on the 21st pair, there is 3 genes instead of 2.
So they have 24.
They have 24 genes instead of 23. Again, 23andMe is not called 23andMe because it's a lucky number. That's literally what you have. And on the 21st, whatever you want to call it, there's a third when there should only be 2.
Right.
And that is what causes.
So one from mom, one from dad, and a random one.
And then just like a random anomaly. They have an extra chromosome. And it is a very clear link. Like you could do a panel and go, there it is, right there.
And it's very easy to see because it's on the chromosomal level, which is not the individual genes, but it's sort of the whole big picture.
And something like Fragile X. You could look at the X chromosome and see that little piece and go, that's Fragile X.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Fragile X.
But autism, you could look at all the genes and you can't like look and go, oh, well, see there, right there is on that thing. That means that autism.
Because it's in the individual lettering within the chromosomes and it's very complex.
It's they discussed it in the video. It's like looking at a book and you have to basically open the book and go through every recipe and find a spelling mistake in one recipe of one ingredient and go, see, that is what's causing this.
And in reality, our scientific ability is more like looking at all the recipes and seeing whether or not they're cookies.
Right.
But looking for spelling mistakes in the individual ingredients it's very involved. It's possible, but it's very involved.
And if you're looking at the 21st shelf and you go, there's 3 books there and there should be 2, that's easy. You can just look at it and go, you don't even have to do anything else. But with autism, or with the potential for autism as well as other syndromes or disorders, you really have to go down deep to the actual letters and go, there's an A there and it should be a G or whatever it is. I'm not a geneticist. So
And even then, they don't know what that means,
right.
Because they haven't studied it.
That could be a thing.
They're like, there's a G there, but we don't know what that does.
Because the truth is, and again, not trying to get into religion here, but the fact that a human being is created the way they are is super scientific. It is frankly amazing. And the truth is that every single person on earth has something a little bit off, because you can't create that much complexity and not like accidentally like this. There's a thing there that should be a thing, but it's nothing. It could be a nothing. It could be, a little thing that adds an extra freckle to your skin, or like a streak of white in your hair that they don't know why it happened. Like it could just be something so minute, so minor that well, there's a genetic error. That genetic error makes, my nails grow longer than normal. But that genetic error makes my brain not work. Like
now you're getting into Darwinism and the survival of the fittest, right? Genetic errors are what cause evolution.
Exactly.
It's just that they're beneficial genetic errors.
Some are, some aren't. And again, that's like, there's lots of podcasts about evolution and Darwinism. We're not going to get into it.
No.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that is where we're going, is really, again, science. When you see it on TV, when you see it in the crime dramas, when you see it in the medical dramas, it makes it look like we really understand more than we do. But our ability to really understand genetics on that level is quite limited.
It really is. We are in 2024 at the time of this recording, 5783 if you follow the lyric. But we are still we're in the dark, we're in the beginning stages. There was an article that I read in the science journal actually this morning while we were waiting for the bus, and it said something to the effect that they took a square millimeter of the human brain and tried to map it, and they discovered that the amount of data that fits in that square millimeter is in the trillions upon trillions, and that if they actually converted the human brain to an inorganic data like field, it would take, I think, something like 147 acres worth of computers to fill that amount of
and that makes sense. And then people are complaining because your processor is a little slow. Like
exactly,
it's crazy.
The human brain, a square millimeter of the human brain holds more data than any computer that exists today.
And it would have to.
Yes.
It would, because you live for 100 years, maybe, if you're lucky, and you have to process all those memories, all that information, everything you've learned, languages, people, names, dates. Anyway, you know what I'm saying.
Right.
So one of the things that the geneticist in the video that we watched discussed was one benefit of getting genetic testing, they say, is so that the parents of children with ASD don't feel guilty about giving them ASD. So essentially it says it's not your fault that your child has ASD, it's their genes, or so that they can pin it on the dad instead of the mom, or the mom instead of the dad, or it's nobody, or it's a grandma. So what were our thoughts on that, Moshe?
I feel like science is such an important field, and specifically the field of genetic research when it comes to discovering cures for diseases and discovering causes for conditions are so important to the future of medicine and science and chemistry and all that stuff. I don't know that relieving guilt is a worthy endeavor.
Okay, so I produced a child with significant challenges for autism. And I don't know that I've ever woken up in the morning and gone, I feel so guilty about that. I don't understand the concept.
Okay, so, and again, this is a bit of a strange tangent, but there was a really good video by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who I greatly admire, blessed memory, because he passed away a few years ago. And it was to do with anti-Semitism. And as part of the video, anti-Semitism is anti-Jewish racism, by the way. Part of the video, they were discussing why anti-Semitism exists. Again, a weird tangent, but I have a point. And they said that when it comes to a negative situation, when it comes to a negative event, because they're talking about the origins of anti-Semitism, there's two ways you can approach it. You can say, what can we do about this, or who can we blame for this? And when you're looking at a thing like autism, or you're looking at a thing like anything genetic, really, if you have a parent that has a child who has autism, there's a lot of resources out there, especially if it's detected when the child is young. It's very difficult sometimes to detect in babies until you start reaching milestones or not reaching them. But
it's not true. They've actually done studies.
Oh, they do. Fantastic.
They have them. We can look them up and maybe post them somewhere. But they've done studies where you can actually diagnose autism in babies as young as a month because they track eye movements.
That's incredible.
You know, the whole eye contact thing?
That's incredible.
They'll track eye movement.
I'm really interested in that, like advances in science.
But again, that's not genetic science, that's observational science.
Right.
ASD is an observational diagnosis.
So if you have, so you are a new mother, or you're a new father, or you're new parents, and you have a baby, and the testing, like you described, is done, and the baby has now conclusively been, designated this child likely has autism. There's a number of different ways that you would react to that news, or what you would take away from that. And I don't know that it's healthy or even responsible to pander to the argument that one of their main priorities is, whose fault is this? Your child has autism. That's unfortunate. I'm sure there's a lot of things we can do. What can we do to help them? What can we do to help support them? What can we do to guide them? What allowances can we make? What can we do to make their life easier? Not, they have autism? Well, is this my fault? Is this his fault? Whose fault is this?
And again, why? Why is autism one of those things? Because it's so not nice. Could you guys picture, again, our baby has their first asthma attack, and Moshe goes, well, this is clearly your fault. Everybody would say he's so mean. So asthma, why would autism be any different?
Asthma, type 1 diabetes, anything. When you're in a position, especially as a parent, where you're essentially blaming your child's conditions for, on certain things, because so did I do something wrong? Because if you're a new mother, you're going to be worried. Should I drink this? Should I eat this? Maybe I took a pill I shouldn't have taken.
I think also all the mystique around autism, the whole vaccine thing, which has been debunked, by the way. Please don't write me. Don't write me. I don't want to hear about it. The whole vaccine thing and the whole, nurture versus nature. And did you expose your child to mercury? And did you eat tuna while you were pregnant? And did you drink caffeine? There was a lot of those things around that tried to blame the mom in the pregnancy. And the reality is there are some environmental factors, but the vast majority of it is genetic. We just don't understand why.
And and again, as we said at the beginning of the episode, there is a beneficial reason to do genetic testing, either before the case of autism being discovered, or possibly after. And our daughter came home from school. Or if you're in the case of you have a child and the child is now out and about and you've diagnosed them as autistic, you're not, if you're still at the point where you're trying to decide whose fault it is, then that's not helping you as parents, right. And it's certainly not helping the child. Right. Do you think your child cares whose fault it is that they have autism? They don't care. They just know that that's something.
You and I kind of do look at your family members and go, oh yeah, that's the autistic one. That's where you got it from. We kind of do, but it's more of a fun game we play.
Yes, because when you have autism, it's very easy to get to that point where you can kind of make light of it. And it's not to try and diminish or belittle or undermine the fact that being autistic can oftentimes be difficult.
Sometimes wonder why your dad has an obsession with trains or whatever. And it's a fun thing.
And we're in a great position
to talk about.
But at the same time, if you are spending so much time trying to decide whose fault it is, then you're not providing support to your child.
Exactly.
You're not giving your child the needs that it will have, given that it is autistic. You're just trying to allay your own guilt, and guilt has no place in a diagnosis. It really doesn't.
No, it doesn't. So a few things that actually are useful that geneticists have found,
Right.
just for people's information, is that they have now noticed that autism runs in families. It's not because of the MMR vaccine. It's not because mom drank coffee while she was pregnant. It's not because you went bungee jumping when you were 25, whatever. So they have noticed that full siblings, so two full siblings together, will have a 9.3% chance higher to have autism if their sibling has autism. So full siblings, mom and dad, same mom and dad. If one has autism, then the other one will have a 9.3 higher chance, or 10 times higher chance of having
almost 10 times higher chance versus,
And for whatever reason, a maternal half sibling, so you have the same mom, different dad, you will have a 5.8% higher chance.
Right.
A paternal half sibling, so same dads, different mom, you'll have a 3.9% higher chance. And even if your cousin is autistic, so first cousin, you could have a 1.9% higher chance of having an autism diagnosis.
So that child and another child share the same grandparents, basically.
Exactly, yes.
So there's a link. So there's definitely a genetic link.
They've also noticed that if you have an older sibling with autism, you have a much higher risk of having autism yourself. If the older sibling is a girl, it is an extremely high chance that any boys following will have autism. Again, they don't know why, but statistically it's a thing that they've noticed.
There's definitely something to discuss.
For example, Raya is the oldest child that I've, born. And she's different. I don't know. She's some sort of neurospicy. I'm not exactly sure. And Avram came out like full autism and ADHD, which we haven't had diagnosed yet. But a neurologist looked at him and was like, yeah, so bring him back because ADHD. And that is apparently a huge thing. Whereas if the girl is older and they're neurospicy, or even not, if your older sibling is a girl, you have a much higher chance of having genetic predisposition to ASD.
Right.
So let's discuss the three types of testing that they currently do right now. The first is they do a chromosomal array testing. That means they're looking at the 23 chromosomes from mom and 23 from dad and seeing if there's anything amiss there. At this point, that's very easy for them to do. Because they're quite practiced at it, and it's large chunks, right? You're looking at the whole recipe books or the whole shelves at the same time.
That's sort of the array. The array test is typically how you would diagnose trisomy 21, because, like I said, it's very easy to see that third set on the 21st tier or whatever you want to call it.
Then they talk about fragile X, so they check for fragile X chromosome. Boys are more severely affected by that because they only have one X chromosome. And if it has it, then they're affected by a lot of times a much higher risk of ASD.
Yes.
And they have learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities, other things, the shyness, sometimes some unique facial features.
And girls, because they have the two X chromosomes,
it's less obvious.
It's off, like the unhealthy one is offsetting is offset by the healthy one, which causes symptoms, but less severe generally than boys.
And the third one is whole exome sequencing. So that means they literally go through every gene and they check the spelling of all the genetic code. That is the most expensive, the most extensive, the hardest to get, and
it takes the longest.
Probably the least useful because we only know what some of the genes do.
Right, because you could get a bunch of different hits about certain spelling errors, we'll call them. And, you'll look at them and go, well, what does that mean? And we'll go, I don't know.
So syndromes that can arise from these genetic differences, I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time on that. I think we can do maybe a separate video or write a little article about it or something. If that interests people, let us know. The last thing I wanted to talk about is, again, this is one of those why questions. Why would you bother? If you find a gene that is associated with ASD, the person actually may not even have ASD.
Right.
So they have the gene there and they don't have it. I have that actually. I was contacted after my genetic testing and asked if I wanted to participate in a study because I have a gene that should theoretically give me 70% chance of having autism,
Right.
which clearly I must have passed on, right? But we don't know. And if you have no genetic cause, you can totally have ASD.
Right.
So we don't even see what the point of looking for it is.
Right.
Ultimately.
Some things are worth testing. Again, either because they come with, significant health issues or drastically reduced life. Some things are more, I don't know. I think I would characterize them in the category of designer genes.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you kind of prefer that your child be not autistic, or maybe you
or have blue eyes,
or if you want your child to have blue eyes,
or long eyelashes.
You want to basically pick and choose what you want your child to look like,
which is illegal, by the way. I think in most countries, maybe all.
It definitely is, and if it's not, it should be, because there's no instance whatsoever of the color of your child's eyes being a factor in whether or not you either carry the child to term or you love them. And unfortunately, I do have to bring up the case of gender selection, because it's a big deal, because I come from Canada and most recently in British Columbia on the West Coast. And there is a huge instance in the West Coast of not doing certain testing unless it's absolutely necessary. Because in certain cultures, and I won't name them for the sake of not being accused of being racist or whatever, but there are certain cultures that definitely favor males over girls. And they went so far as to actually make it against the law to tell the parents the gender of the child, because it would increase the risk that they would abort a child if they were a girl.
I don't want to go there, but it's absolutely a thing. I don't even believe in gender selection. And again, it's illegal, I believe, in most places. I think some places you can do it, but I would have to do research on that. And then I don't know that I would want anybody to look at my Google history if I did research on that.
It's definitely a big thing, and I know that in Canada they're really trying to restrict it, and it already is quite restricted. Mm-hmm. Because needless to say, if you do genetic testing on a baby, you can easily determine what sex it is.
Obviously.
And they definitely don't want to get into
They
that.
do have a test now. Did you know that when mom is pregnant and baby is far enough along, they can take mom's blood and sequence the entire baby's genome?
Interesting.
Yeah, so you can see everything. And it puts a lot of people at ease, because they do test for a lot of the bad stuff before baby's even big enough to see on an ultrasound. But also,
right, because it's not. It's again one of those things where you're like, okay, the baby's there. Does it really matter unless it's something that could significantly impact their life?
Now we're getting into a pro-choice talk, which I'm happy to talk about again separately. Enough interest would have to be shown in order for me to do that. I'm going to go out on the record here and say that I am pro-choice. I have interesting theories about what choices I would make, and I'm willing to talk about them right now.
Religiously, you really can't help but be pro-choice, because if you are of the mind that every life is sacred and every child is important, then they have to be allowed to thrive in whatever capacity they can. But ultimately, the child is.
We don't believe in suffering.
Part of the mother, and I mean, again, I'm not going to get into it. But if the mother determines that the baby's at risk of suffering, then obviously we have to consider those sorts of things. But again, that's a great conversation that we can certainly get into if enough interest is. But otherwise, we'll try to stay away from the abortion debate as much as possible.
Okay, so with our last 10 minutes, let's talk about our actual experience. So they already know, I've said twice, that I had a bunch of blood drawn and they did genetic testing.
Right.
And then because we said the words autism, we just said them in the office,
Mm.
while they were deciding which blood test to run on me, we were summoned to a genetic counselor.
Yeah.
We walked into the room, and you actually had a very interesting thought process about it before we went, because you said, well, having ASD is really hard for me, honey. If we can not have a kid with ASD, that would be a good thing. That was actually what you said to me before we went. After we went in there, after hearing what the geneticist had to say, Moshe changed his mind drastically and quickly. I was always of the mind that it's not the type of thing that I want to test for, because it's not the type of thing I'd want to exclude or get rid of. But he had a different opinion. So we sat down, right? And the genetic counselor looked directly at you and then asked a whole bunch of like really invasive and inappropriate questions,
Mm-hmm.
right? Are you healthy? What do they define as healthy? Somebody with no genetic predisposition to anything. And of course you had to answer no. And once the autism thing came up, that was all she thought about. I was the mom literally sitting there going, I'm the one who's going to be pregnant. I was trying to interject literally. I have these genetic issues. Would you like to look at them? And she was like, no, let's talk about autism for 4 hours. And then she definitely said, well, based on what I'm seeing, he has a very strong history of passing on autism. And are you sure that you want to do this? And, we do have the possibility of looking at any zygotes that you produce. And, she didn't say the words, but it came through as deleting any mistakes that might be there. And that's when you sort of looked at me and said, honey, I'm not a mistake. And I said, I know, I told you. And I think we kindly, on my part kindly, on his part not so kindly, told the geneticist that we're done now. And if this isn't a necessary thing to do in order for us to have a baby, we would like to.
Basically, yes. The idea of creating a child, if you have the option, that is not autistic,
It was tempting to you for like 3.5 seconds.
It may be preferable on the surface, but deep down, you really do have to consider the fact that we're talking about an actual, life potential. And it's the difference between being able to go in and like switch off the autism in a particular zygote and just being like, well, no, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about just like doing something and then, oh, they're not autistic anymore.
I'm more the sciencey one, so Moshe didn't understand. And when he didn't understand what they meant by it. And when she explained that they would be creating zygotes, right? So creating life, basically, essentially babies, not to full term or anything, and then throwing them away, he was horrified.
Yeah, it's
because we don't have the ability to turn on and off genes, right? But you didn't know that.
I'm not as familiar with science, so I wasn't clear on what we were talking about. And when I was clear on it, I'm definitely of the mind that every life is important, especially if it's like from me. Like I don't think that any part of me should be thrown away because it's a little bit off.
Yeah. So yeah, he looked at me and said, honey, I'm not a mistake. And I said, honey, I agreed before we even came in here. And then we said to her, can we still proceed if we don't do all your, because she wanted to do all kinds of testing on you and to see if they could find a gene that they could, use to select for the best embryos, et cetera, et cetera. And we said, is it necessary? She said, no, you'll just have to sign a waiver. And we said, okay, bye.
Yes, I would gladly sign a waiver that said that I'm aware that my child has a good chance of being autistic. Like, oh, well, whatever.
I mean, them just living in my uterus, they have a good chance of being autistic because there's an oldest female sibling and their older brother is profoundly autistic. So,
Oh, well, we're in for the ride. And it's going to be a really awesome journey, and we definitely look forward to involving all of you on it with us, depending on how things go and what have you. But so this is another episode. We're really, really going to try to stick to a Sunday recording schedule and little content. So if you haven't had a chance to check out our TikTok or our Instagram or Facebook, then I would advise you to go do that. There's a lot of really funny stuff that Leah and I put up. a lot of stuff involving the kids. We're still going to try and figure out a way to involve the kids in some way in the podcast. And
I mean, they heard Raya come home today.
They did. She was already, it was her debut on this. You can email us at contact us at nowyouknowonautistic.com. You can search for Now You Know One Autistic on YouTube, on Apple Music, on Spotify, on Podchaser, on iHeartRadio.
And it really helps us a lot, actually, when you just listen, download, share, rate, interact with the podcast in any way.
On our Podbean homepage, of course.
And also check out our Patreon. I mean, it does allow us to do more of this content if you like it.
We do have the ability to have you, tip us or donate to us if you want. It's on the website. It can be a little or it can be a lot. It doesn't really matter. There's some little gifts and stuff that I put up for people that give a certain amount. But honestly, if you like what we're saying and you want us to keep saying it, it definitely helps. But we're going to try and keep it as simplified as possible. So thank you very much for listening today, and enjoy the pleasant sounds of our outro. Well, that's our show for today. Now you know One Autistic just a little bit better. So something you may not know about some autistics is that we often struggle with ending social interactions. So, Leah?
All right, Moshe, I'll take care of it. Thank you for listening to Now You Know One Autistic. See you next week.